On the morning of April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler awoke in the Führer bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin to celebrate his 56th birthday. Outside, the Reich he had promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing in real time. Soviet forces had encircled the capital. American and British armies were pushing from the west. The skies above Germany belonged entirely to Allied bombers. Inside that concrete tomb beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, Nazi officials gathered to offer hollow congratulations to a man whose delusions had cost tens of millions of lives. But the most memorable birthday greeting Hitler received that day came not from his sycophantic subordinates, but from the soldiers of the Red Army. And it arrived with the thunder of long-range artillery. At precisely 11:30 in the morning, Soviet guns opened fire on Berlin for the first time. The shells that screamed across the spring sky toward the German capital carried more than high explosives. They carried the rage of a nation that had suffered unimaginable devastation, the determination of an army that had clawed its way back from the edge of annihilation, and the promise of final retribution for the crimes of Operation Barbarossa. This was not merely a military bombardment. It was a statement, a symbolic act of vengeance delivered on the most appropriate day imaginable. The men who fired those first shells had traveled an almost incomprehensible distance, not just in kilometers, but in historical experience, from the desperate defense of Stalingrad to the gates of the enemy capital itself. The artillery unit that delivered this deadly birthday message belonged to the 47th Army, commanded by Major Ardalion Zhukin. His division had pushed ahead of the main Soviet advance with remarkable speed and audacity. In the pre-dawn hours of April 20th, Zhukin's artillerymen had overtaken both the tank units and infantry formations that typically led the advance, racing forward to occupy the village of Bayerndorf, located several dozen kilometers from Berlin's outskirts. This was no small feat. The final approach to Berlin required navigating a landscape scarred by years of total war, crossing rivers and canals that the Germans had desperately tried to defend, pushing through towns where fanatical Hitler Youth and Volkssturm militia fought with the desperation of those who knew defeat meant the end of everything they had believed. When Zhukin and his men arrived at Bayerndorf that morning, they found themselves in an eerie tactical vacuum. As the major himself later recalled, he looked ahead and saw neither Soviet forces nor German defenders. The front line, that constantly shifting boundary between life and death, had momentarily dissolved in the chaos of the Reich's final collapse. 2 years earlier, such a situation would have been terrifying for artillerymen. Artillery units were vulnerable when isolated, their guns designed for indirect fire rather than close combat. German machine gun teams had inflicted terrible casualties on exposed Soviet artillery throughout the war. The guns themselves, while powerful, were indeed clumsy in defensive situations, difficult to reposition quickly when enemy infantry closed in. But this was the spring of 1945, and everything had changed. As Zhukin remembered, his men were not afraid of anything anymore. They had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. They had endured battles where entire divisions were destroyed in days. They had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had also witnessed the gradual but inexorable turning of the tide, the transformation of the Red Army from a force fighting for survival into an unstoppable instrument of retribution. By April 1945, these were not the same soldiers who had desperately defended Moscow in the winter of 1941 or clung to the rubble of Stalingrad in 1942. These were veterans of Kursk, of Bagration, of the Vistula-Oder offensive. They had broken the back of the Wehrmacht across 1,000 kilometers of blood-soaked territory and now they stood at the threshold of final victory. Zhukin's men rolled 12 long-range guns into position. These were A-19 cannons, 122mm pieces, with a range of over 20 kilometers. Soviet industry had produced these weapons in substantial numbers throughout the war, and they had proven themselves effective against both fortifications and massed enemy formations. The A-19 fired a shell weighing 25 kilograms, and in the hands of experienced crews, it could maintain a rate of fire of 5 to 6 rounds per hour in sustained bombardment. The gun's effective range meant that Zhukin's battery could strike deep into Berlin's outskirts from their position in Bayerndorf, bringing the reality of Soviet vengeance directly into the heart of the Nazi capital. Before loading the guns, the soldiers performed a ritual that spoke volumes about the emotional weight of this moment. They took chalk or paint and wrote messages on the shells themselves. The inscriptions read, "From the Guardsmen of Stalingrad to Hitler personally." This was not random graffiti. It was a deliberate invocation of the battle that had marked the turning point of the entire war in the East, perhaps the turning point of the Second World War itself. Stalingrad was where the myth of German invincibility had died, in the frozen ruins of a city that refused to fall. It was where the Red Army had surrounded and destroyed an entire German field army, the Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus, along with substantial Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces. The battle had raged from August 1942 to February 1943, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and reducing a major industrial city to a wasteland of rubble and corpses. Many of the men in Zhukin's unit likely were veterans of Stalingrad or had comrades who had fought there. The city's defense had become the defining symbol of Soviet resistance, the place where the Nazi tide had finally been stopped and then reversed. To inscribe those shells with a message from Stalingrad's guardsmen was to connect this moment of triumph directly to that earlier moment of desperate defense. It was to say that the soldiers who had held the line when everything seemed lost were now delivering justice to the man who had ordered the destruction of their homeland. The shells were not just weapons. They were historical statements, physical manifestations of the arc of the war itself. At 11:30, the guns spoke. The first Soviet shells to fall on Berlin tore through the spring air and crashed into the city's outskirts. For the residents of Berlin, this bombardment marked the beginning of the end. For weeks they had heard the distant rumble of artillery growing steadily closer. Now the shells were falling on their own streets. The psychological impact was immense. Berlin had been bombed from the air repeatedly since 1943, with RAF and USAF raids reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble and killing tens of thousands of civilians. But artillery fire was different. Bombing raids came and went. Artillery bombardment, once it began, could continue day and night, a relentless pounding that made normal life impossible and signaled that enemy ground forces were close enough to directly target the city. For Hitler, receiving this news in his bunker, the artillery barrage must have carried a particular sting. He had launched Operation Barbarossa on June the 22nd, 1941, with the explicit goal of destroying the Soviet Union within a matter of months. The plan had called for a rapid advance that would capture Leningrad, Moscow, and the industrial regions of Ukraine before winter. Hitler and his generals had believed the Red Army would collapse under the weight of the German blitzkrieg, just as the Polish, French, and other armies had collapsed before it. They had fundamentally misunderstood both the scale of the Soviet Union and the determination of its people to resist. The initial German advance had indeed been devastating. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in massive cauldron battles. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured in the first months of the campaign. By December 1941, German forces stood within sight of Moscow's outskirts, but they had not achieved the knockout blow they needed. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Instead, it had absorbed the German punch and begun to mobilize its vast resources and population for total war. The failure to capture Moscow in 1941 marked the beginning of Germany's strategic defeat in the East, though it would take nearly 4 more years of unimaginably brutal fighting to translate that strategic reality into actual military victory. The road from Moscow in December 1941 to Berlin in April 1945 was paved with the bodies of millions. The Eastern Front was the largest and deadliest theater of the Second World War, accounting for roughly 80% of all German military casualties and the vast majority of Soviet losses. Battles on the Eastern Front involved hundreds of divisions, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and millions of soldiers fighting across fronts that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The scale of the violence was almost incomprehensible. Single battles like Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Belarusian offensive involved casualties that exceeded the total losses of many nations in the entire war. The Red Army that approached Berlin in April 1945 bore little resemblance to the force that had staggered under the German onslaught in 1941. Through a combination of brutal experience, massive industrial mobilization, and increasingly sophisticated operational doctrine, Soviet forces had transformed into the most powerful land army in the world. Soviet tank production had outstripped German production by enormous margins. The T-34 medium tank, continuously improved throughout the war, had proven itself superior to most German armor in the crucial combination of firepower, protection, and mobility. Soviet artillery, always a strength of the Red Army, had been organized into massive concentrations that could deliver overwhelming firepower at decisive points. The Red Army had also developed operational concepts, particularly the deep battle doctrine refined by commanders like Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky, that enabled them to break through German defenses and exploit those breakthroughs with devastating effectiveness. By the spring of 1945, the Red Army was a steamroller. The Vistula Oder Offensive, launched on January 12, 1945, had advanced over 500 kilometers in 3 weeks, pushing from the Vistula River in Poland to the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. This operation involved over 2 million Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, and massive artillery concentrations. German forces in the east, depleted by years of attrition and increasingly composed of undertrained and poorly equipped units, could not contain the Soviet advance. By early April, Soviet forces had established bridgeheads across the Oder and were preparing for the final assault on Berlin itself. The Berlin Offensive, which began on April 16, 1945, was one of the largest military operations in history. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front, totaling over 2.5 million soldiers, more than 6,000 tanks, and over 40,000 artillery pieces, attacked the German defenses protecting the capital. The Germans fought with desperate ferocity, knowing that defeat meant the end of the Nazi regime, and likely their own deaths. Hitler had ordered the city defended to the last, and fanatical Nazi officials enforced this command with summary executions of anyone suspected of defeatism. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Red Army had overwhelming superiority in numbers, firepower, and operational capability. When Zhukin's artillery opened fire on April 20th, they were part of this massive offensive. Within 2 days, as the major noted, tens of thousands of Soviet guns were firing on Berlin. This artillery bombardment was one of the most intense in military history. Soviet doctrine emphasized artillery as the decisive arm, and they had concentrated enormous firepower for the final assault. The bombardment served multiple purposes. It destroyed German fortifications and strongpoints. It disrupted communications and command structures. It killed and demoralized German defenders. And crucially, it provided cover for Soviet infantry and armor as they fought their way into the city's outskirts and then into the urban core itself. The fighting in Berlin was savage. Urban combat favored defenders, and the Germans used every building, every street corner, every basement as a fighting position. Soviet forces had to clear the city block by block, building by building, often room by room. The casualties were enormous on both sides. Soviet commanders, eager to capture the city before the Western Allies could arrive, and motivated by Stalin's demand for rapid victory, pushed their units forward relentlessly. The Red Army's tactics in Berlin combined massive artillery and tank support with infantry assault groups that used flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarters weapons to clear buildings. By April the 25th, Soviet forces had completely encircled the city, trapping the remaining German defenders and whatever civilian population had not fled or been evacuated. Hitler's birthday celebration in the bunker on April 20th was one of the last times most of his inner circle saw him. Shortly after the celebration, many Nazi leaders fled Berlin, seeking to escape the approaching Soviet forces, or to position themselves for whatever came next. Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, sent a telegram from southern Germany asking if he should assume leadership of the Reich, which Hitler interpreted as treason. Heinrich Himmler attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, another act Hitler considered betrayal. In the bunker, Hitler raged against the incompetence and disloyalty of his subordinates, alternating between delusional plans for counterattacks by armies that no longer existed and moments of recognition that the end had come. On April 30th, 1945, 10 days after his birthday and the first Soviet artillery barrage, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Eva Braun, whom he had married the day before, died with him. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery Garden, doused with gasoline, and burned in a shell crater while Soviet shells continued to fall on the surrounding area. The man who had launched a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, who had ordered the murder of millions in pursuit of racial ideology and Lebensraum, who had brought destruction to an entire continent, died in a concrete box beneath the ruins of his capital while the soldiers of the Red Army fought in the streets above. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, when Germany signed unconditional surrender documents. Berlin had fallen on May 2nd after a final suicidal defense of the Reichstag and the government quarter. The cost of the Berlin operation alone was staggering. Soviet forces suffered approximately 80,000 killed and nearly 300,000 wounded. German military and civilian casualties were even higher, with estimates ranging from 100 to 25,000 to 175,000 killed. The city itself was devastated, with much of the urban core reduced to rubble by artillery, aerial bombing, and street fighting. For Major Ardalion Zyukin, the artillery officer who had ordered the first shells fired at Berlin, recognition came on May 30th, 1945. He was awarded the Order of Lenin, one of the Soviet Union's highest decorations. This award acknowledged not just his tactical initiative in pushing his guns forward to fire on Berlin, but the symbolic importance of that first bombardment. Zyukin had delivered the opening blow in the final battle, the first physical manifestation of Soviet vengeance reaching into the Nazi capital. His actions embodied the Red Army's journey from desperate defense to total victory, from Stalingrad to Berlin. The story of how the Red Army congratulated Hitler on his birthday is more than an anecdote about well-timed artillery fire. It encapsulates the entire arc of the war in the East. It represents the transformation of the Soviet Union from victim to victor, the journey of the Red Army from the brink of destruction to the gates of Berlin. Those shells inscribed with messages from Stalingrad's guardsmen were the physical manifestation of historical justice, the reply to 4 years of invasion, occupation, and genocide. They were the answer to the millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians killed by German forces, to the villages burned, the cities destroyed, the populations enslaved or murdered. The Eastern Front shaped the modern world in ways that continue to resonate today. The Soviet victory over Nazi Germany established the USSR as a superpower and gave it control over Eastern Europe for the next 4 decades. The experience of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it, became central to Soviet identity and later to Russian national identity. The memory of the victory, the enormous sacrifices made, and the pride in having defeated Nazi Germany remain powerful forces in Russian political culture. Victory Day, celebrated on May 9th, is the most important secular holiday in Russia, a day when the entire nation commemorates those who fought and died to defend the motherland. The cost of that victory was almost beyond comprehension. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people in the war, roughly 15% of its total population. This figure includes both military personnel and civilians, though the distinction was often meaningless in a war characterized by deliberate targeting of civilian populations, mass starvation in besieged cities, and the systematic murder of Jews, political commissars, and others deemed enemies by Nazi racial ideology. Entire generations were decimated. Hardly a family in the Soviet Union escaped untouched. The demographic impact lasted for decades, creating imbalances and shortages that affected Soviet society long after the war ended. The artillery barrage that greeted Hitler on his final birthday was thus not merely a military operation or even a symbolic gesture. It was a moment when the accumulated weight of suffering, sacrifice, and determination found expression in high explosive and steel. It was the sound of history itself delivering judgment. Those 12 guns firing from Bayendorf announced that the reckoning had arrived, that the nation which had been invaded and nearly destroyed was now at the gates of the aggressor's capital, ready to exact the final price for the crimes of Barbarossa. The thunder of Soviet artillery over Berlin in April 1945 was the sound of the 20th century's most terrible war reaching its conclusion. The sound of justice delivered through violence. The sound of a birthday greeting that no one could ignore or forget.